Also in 1968, along with the Tet Offensive, the Czechs, like the Hungarians before them, see an opportunity in the replacement of Khrushchev by Brezhnev in Russia, and their communist government begins to liberalize. And as Khrushchev in 56, Brezhnev in 68 sends in the tanks and crushes what is called the Prague Spring, Prague being the capital of Czechoslovakia. Communism suppresses any form of lightening up or liberalization. Counterculture is an anti-Western culture within the West. You're familiar with it. Our society swims in it. The society that has replaced the traditional Judeo-Christian society of World War II in the 1950s is counterculture. Rock and roll and rap is counterculture. If it feels good, do it is counterculture. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll is counterculture. University protests against war and for a new form of communism is counterculture. Secularization and dechristianization of society is counterculture. Free, easy, available pornography is counterculture. The destruction of traditional values through a philosophy invented by Jacques Derrida called deconstructivism is counterculture, where you systematically look at everything that has been treated as virtuous and valuable, and you undercut it after the fact, showing that it's just disgusting. The Last Jedi, Star Wars Episode 8, is counterculture. Feminist movement that sees an endless battle between men and women is counterculture. Identity politics is counterculture. Wokeness is counterculture. In the name of getting rid of racism and sexism, hyperactively focusing on race and sex all the time is counterculture. The neutering of the traditional West and its replacement by a new secularized utopia, that is all counterculture. And it comes out of the baby boom generation that is born in the 10 years after World War II. It comes out of the long strife over a drafty army fighting in a Vietnam War that the brass doesn't seem interested in winning, at a time when the church, the Roman Catholic Church, reforms itself with the Vatican II reforms, abandoning Latin Rite Mass, abandoning its traditional approaches to many things, compromising with the modern world, opening itself up to liberation theology. All of this is counterculture. It is movements friendly to communism within Western societies as popular movements that undermine traditional Western sensibilities of freedom, individual responsibility, and objective morality. It is extremely powerful. And it has been the counterculture has become the culture somewhere between the 1960s and the early 2000s. It's the dominant culture in media, in entertainment, on college campuses, and now in corporate America. This counterculture value, this anti-Western Western civilization is growing, but it is a product of the Cold War. It was something encouraged by communists. Another aspect of the Cold War is the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The space race is begun in Sputnik, and for Americans, it ends with the Apollo program. In the United States, we are going to compete with the Soviets, and we are going to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, so John F. Kennedy promised, and then he was assassinated, martyred, and his promise was finally fulfilled. We have 3 manned space programs in the 1950s and 60s. Project Mercury gets Americans into space. Project Gemini gets Americans to learn how to put multiple people in space, do spacewalks, and do rendezvous between spacecraft. Project Apollo launches spaceships to the moon, lands several American expeditions on the moon between July 21st, 1969 and December of 1972. The only people who've ever been to the moon were American astronauts. Next time you look at the moon, think about that. We've been there. We should be back. But we're not. Counterculture. In any event, most Americans think we win the space race on 21st July 1969. However, the fact that Americans now need to hitch rides with Russians in order to get into space and to get to the space station that we built, the so-called International Space Station, is an American product, primarily an American inspiration. That's an indication that the Russians actually did a pretty darn good job in the long run. We won the sprint to the moon. The Russians seem to have, at least thus far, won the cross-country race for ongoing presence in space. And the Chinese communists are now trying to develop their own manned space program so that they can be the next people on the moon. By the end of the 1960s, there is the doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The MAD doctrine says that if we go to war with the Soviets and if they go to war with us, the world will end. The only way to win is not to play. And MAD involves, in the United States, a nuclear triad. On the one hand, you have manned bombers. That's one leg of the triad. Second hand, the most reliable, you have submarine-launched ballistic nuclear missiles on submarines hidden under the surface of the ocean. They are still the most reliable nuclear systems that we have. And the third leg of the triad is land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that can launch over the North Pole and hit targets in Russia. And they have the same thing. The Russians have their own version of the nuclear triad. Mutually assured destruction is a guarantee that if we do go full-scale war, it's over for everything. So let's not. In the 1970s, thanks to the rise of counterculture and the war of attrition and ultimate defeat in Vietnam, the generational divide between the World War II generation and the baby boomers, who were young protesters at that point, the divisions that are being fanned by attempts to have civil rights or attempts to create permanent identity politic divides between people, the divisions between men and women, gays and straights, all weaken the West. The West acts like it's as fatigued as it was right after World War I. We also have a theme that I'll be hitting next week, which is the destruction of Europe's empires with American help, and the granting of independence to a bunch of countries that are not ready for it, and that turn out to be a bunch of dictatorships in what we call the third world. The first world is the free world, the second world is the communist world, the third world is the former colonies of Europe given independence. And throughout the third world, there are a bunch of communist revolutions or wars of national liberation or people's liberation wars where the Soviets are expanding their power beyond Europe. Another thing that has happened, this happened around 1960, is with the death of Stalin, Mao saw himself as the head of world communism. Khrushchev saw himself, and later Brezhnev, as the head of world communism. Mao said, I'm senior next to Stalin. I've been around longer than any of you new Russians. I control the most populous communist country in the world. I should be in charge. The Russians say, well, you may do that, but you're a backward country. And in the 1950s and 60s, Russia is putting men in space, so we're going to be in charge. This creates a Sino-Soviet split. And basically, you've got three superpowers. You've got the United States, the Soviet Union, and Communist China. And at the time, the Soviet Union seems to be in ascendance in the early 1970s, so the United States and China begin making deals with one another. These deals come out in the form of détente. President Nixon goes to Beijing, China, and meets with Mao Zedong and his Prime Minister Chou En-lai, and normalizes relations. We abandon the Taiwanese in terms of their seat at the United Nations, and we set a stage that's going to lead us to recognize the People's Republic of China while still guaranteeing Taiwan's defense. We do this because the Soviets, at the end of the Vietnam War, do seem to be expanding in Africa, in Asia, and everywhere. And the Chinese form of communism is different from the Soviet form of communism. Détente is a French word for the release of tensions. It's an archery term. If an archer decides not to shoot, pulling the arrow forward and loosening tension on the bowstring, that is détente. So Nixon negotiates not only with Mao Zedong, he negotiates with Leonid Brezhnev. He goes to Moscow as well as Beijing, and he and his successors create a reduction in tension in the Cold War, an increase in diplomacy. And one of the products of détente is the Helsinki Accords on Human Rights. And the Helsinki Accords on Human Rights of 1975 is a big deal for this reason. The Soviets agree, for the first time, that there is an objective thing called human rights, and that they in communist countries will try to abide by it. The Soviets could care less about such things. It's just pillow talk. But the fact that they signed this treaty is actually going to make it harder for them to employ Stalinist-style repression in Eastern Europe in the late 70s and early 1980s. Détente is the key. But as we leave the 1970s, communism is on the march with its victory in Vietnam. Next door in Cambodia, in 1975, the Khmer Rouge take over, communist Cambodians. In 4 years, they kill over 1/3 of the Cambodian population. This event is called the Killing Fields of Kampuchea, the communist name for Cambodia. They kill anyone with dental work, like caps on their teeth, eyeglasses, college degrees, who speak foreign languages, who know advanced math. Anyone who isn't a peasant and who isn't Khmer Rouge is liable to be killed. They give 13-year-olds the power of life and death over everyone in the community. It's worse than Lord of the Flies. Killing 1/3 to half their population in 4 years on purpose, that's Black Death levels. That's well beyond any war we've fought in human history. It's a big problem. And ultimately, in 1979, the communist Vietnamese end up rolling in as heroes and stopping the Khmer Rouge and its killing fields. And you end up with just normal Vietnamese-style communism and murder rather than the kind of crazy murder that the Khmer Rouge were engaged in. In Africa, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Zambia, attacking Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, attacking South Africa, Soviet allies among Africa's newly independent communist movements are on the march. So the United States and China are going to team up in order to balance against the Soviets.